Fox's live valve is a product which has been in the pipeline for years. We first saw it on pros bikes back in 2015, but now it's finally ready to be sold to the public, and I've been riding it for the last 2 months. Basically, what Fox Live Valve does is it automatically locks and unlocks your suspension for you as you ride. The Live Valve fork damper is a modified version of Fox's Fit 4 damper, which is their sort of middle of the range damper. Live Valve is not compatible with Fox's latest Grip 2 damper. The default setting is to have both the fork and the shock locked out to give you the maximum pedaling efficiency. However, there is a sensor, an accelerometer in the fork and one by the rear axle. And when either of those detect a bump, they will open up both shocks within 3 milliseconds according to Fox. And the clever part is that both dampers will remain open for a predetermined amount of time, and then they will lock again, unless there is a bump detected within that predetermined amount of time, in which case the timer starts again. So if you're riding a rough section of trail where the bumps are coming quite frequently, there'll never be a big enough gap between bumps for the timer to expire, and so both dampers will stay fully open the whole time until you come to a flatter section of trail, a smoother section of trail, when the lockouts will lock again. Now, the length of time that the shocks remain open is critical. You don't want it to be too short, otherwise the dampers would be open and closing the whole time on a technical trail. But you don't want it to be too long, otherwise when you start getting on the power, the shocks would still be open and you'd lose some of the advantage. So the amount of time depends on 2 main factors. Firstly, the system has a controller mounted on the down tube, which has 5 different settings. The first mode is the most open, so the shocks stay open for the longest. The 5th mode gives you the shortest amount of time with the shocks open before they get back into the efficient lockdown mode. The second factor is actually the gradient on which you're riding. Now, that central controller has a 3-axis accelerometer, which can tell whether you're going uphill, downhill, or along the flat. And it adjusts the amount of time the shocks remain open accordingly. So if you're going uphill, the shocks close up much faster than if you're going downhill. And if you're on the flat, it's somewhere in between. So now you can imagine a table of 15 different combinations of the 5 different modes and the 3 different gradients it can detect. And the manufacturer can preset the amount of time the shocks remain open in each setting. They can also preset the amount of force that the accelerometers need to detect before they will open up the shocks. That's something that the manufacturer of the bike will preset, but which you can, in theory, go to a bike shop and fiddle about with. It may be that down the line, Fox will make it easier for the consumer to adjust it themselves, but to be honest, I never felt the need to adjust it myself. That 3-way accelerometer will also detect freefall, so it knows if you're in the air, and when it detects that, it will open up the shocks so that when you land, you have a comfier landing. The total system weight is quite hard to define because the lockout mechanism is built into the shock and into the fork, but the battery controller itself and the sensors combined weigh about 180 grams. The shock and the fork will weigh slightly more than non-live valve equivalents, but you're talking about a small weight penalty of 200 grams or so. If you compare it to a cable lockout system for the fork and shock, it'll weigh about 140 grams or so more than that kind of arrangement. The battery life is also very hard to define. Fox suggests it will last about 16 to 20 hours of riding. This depends a huge amount on what kind of riding you do. If you're constantly going from smooth to rough terrain and back again, it will deplete the battery a lot faster than if you're doing long smooth climbs and then long rough descents, where the system may only have to operate once or twice. The most I've ever done is 3 or 4 rides in between recharging the battery, and I've never actually got to the point where I've run out of charge on the trail. But Fox tell me that if you do run out of battery, it will default to unlocking the suspension so that you can ride home more comfortably and more safely. The system can be fitted to any 32, 34 or 36 forks, including step cast variations. These shocks are live valve specific and they are based around the older DPS and DPX shocks. Giant, Pivot and Scott will offer complete bikes fitted with live valve, Those three companies, as well as a few others including Rocky Mountain, have live valve compatible bikes which live valve can be retrofitted to. The final thing I need to tell you before I get on to how it rides is the cost. It costs between $3,000 and $3,250 for the full kit. That includes the fork, the shock, and all of the electronic gubbins that you need. Most people, I suspect, will buy live valve as part of a complete bike, and there will be a surcharge for this. So that's all the stats and facts, but how does it ride? The first thing to note is that it opens up impressively quickly. As soon as I got hold of the bike, the first thing I did was put the live valve system on and ride headlong at a curb really fast. And handily, my wrists weren't broken by a locked out fork. So you can very easily switch live valve off, in which case it just opens the shocks and leaves them open. So what I did was I rode at the curb with the system off and with the system on alternately. And to be honest, I couldn't feel much of a difference in harshness between those two scenarios. So for that very first bump, where the system has to detect the bump and open up the shocks after you've hit the bump, it opens up so fast that there isn't much of a difference in smoothness between the system being on and off. When it comes to descending on rough trails, it stays open the whole time anyway, so it's just as smooth with the system off and on. And again, I did back-to-back tests and I couldn't detect much difference in smoothness, if any. But what the system is designed for is climbing, and on smooth trails you do notice a significant difference in the firmness of the bike. It seems to pedal more efficiently, there's less pedal bob, especially when standing up and sprinting out of the saddle. Although having said that, I tested the system on a Pivot Mach 5.5, which pedals really quite efficiently anyway. So there's not a huge amount of difference, especially when it comes to seated climbing. It's not a night and day difference, but when you're sprinting really hard, you can notice that it's more efficient and more stable under power. The only time I noticed a significant disadvantage with the system was during steep seated climbs. A firm lockout on the shock can give you a higher ride height on the rear suspension, which steepens up the seat angle and makes climbing a little bit easier when in the saddle. The live valve locks the fork out as well, so the fork rides higher in the travel, which kind of counteracts that effect a little bit. So what I ended up doing was getting Fox to lighten the tune on the locked out setting of the fork, basically giving more bypass oil flow to the shock lockout, which allowed the shock to sink a little lower in its travel, and that really did help with seated climbing, although you do compromise the efficiency of the fork when you're out of the saddle and sprinting hard. This is not an adjustment that you could easily make at home, however, so unless bike brands change the tune of their fork relative to the shock lockout settings, it's maybe something that you're going to have to put up with. This is also something we found with Scott's twin lock bikes, which have a cable operated fork and shock lockout. There were times where we would like the shock to be locked out but not the fork, and the same goes with live valve. Having a fork lockout is not always what you want for seated climbing in particular. Aside from wishing for a softer fork setup for technical climbing, I never really had any situations where I caught the system out. It was always unlocked when I wanted it to be unlocked. It was always locked when I wanted it to be locked. And this was all in mode number 1, so the most open mode there is. I never really felt the need for those firmer modes. So perhaps the system could be simplified and just have a single mode. I don't think this is something you can recreate with a manual lockout. You're never going to use it as often as this system operates. And even if you do, there's a possibility to forget and leave it locked out and ride it when you're riding over bumps, or leave it open when you're sprinting. You're never going to recreate such a fast and foolproof operation of the lockouts with a manual lockout, and you just don't really think about it while you're riding. There have been similar systems, such as specialized brain technology, which uses an inertia valve to automatically lock and unlock the suspension, but it's just not as fast, it's not as responsive, it's much more clunky feeling than live valve. Then there's Lapierre's EI system, but this only locks out the shock via a sensor in the fork, so it cannot do front and rear lockouts. So while there have been other systems which have tried to do a similar thing, none have done it to anywhere near the degree of sophistication or speed that Live Valve does. That said, it is a very expensive system, and on a bike like the Pivot that I tested it on, it's not going to change your world. If you fitted it to a bike that was less naturally pedal efficient, like for example a Kona Process or a Giant Rain, then it would make a much more substantial difference and it would be a bigger advantage. For cross-country racers and enduro racers on pedally courses, it could be a substantial advantage, particularly if your bike isn't naturally pedal efficient. Hopefully in the future it might come down in price, and then maybe one day we'll see bikes designed around the system such that they don't have to compromise pedaling efficiency for suspension sensitivity and can have the suspension completely optimized for sensitivity because it doesn't need to be pedal efficient because Live Valve will take care of that. But I think that's years away if we'll ever see that. For now though, I would say that the system is more impressive than it is necessary, certainly at the kind of price that it's selling for. If I did have loads of money to spend on suspension upgrades, I would probably personally be looking at something like Fox's latest Grip 2 36, which I think has significantly better performance when you're descending, or for that matter, RockShox's Lyric RC2, which again I think has superior descending performance to the Fit 4 damper, which the Live Valve system uses. So that's Fox Live Valve. It's very impressive technology, it works as intended, but at these prices it's not ready for the mass market. Hopefully it'll trickle down to more affordable price points in future, and we're really looking forward to seeing where that goes. Let us know in the comments what you think, and don't forget to like or subscribe.